Hello and welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. I'm Eric Young. Today's episode is a little different. I'm releasing the second half of a longer conversation ahead of schedule because it felt especially timely. The headlines right now are full of trade tensions, tariffs, and talk of reshoring supply chains. What do these policies mean for the critical minerals sector and for countries like Canada? To help unpack that, I spoke with Lyle Trytten. Lyle has been dubbed the nickel nerd. He's a Canadian chemical engineer with decades of experience in metallurgical processing, project development, and sustainability. He's worked on mining and refining projects all over the world, from Indonesia to Madagascar to Alberta, and he brings a rare combination of deep technical expertise and sharp systems thinking. In this half of our conversation, we dive into how deep sea mining fits into the broader geopolitics of mineral supply chains, why tariffs might not work the way policymakers hope, and just how dependent the US is on Canadian mineral imports.
The reality of setting up these industries is that they are very intensive in their use of specific skills and expertise. It's easy to design a new facility on paper. It's hard to build, commission, startup, operate a facility and make it work.
We also explore the current wave of Canadian backlash towards US trade policy and whether Canada offers a model for responsible mining regulation. The first half of our conversation, covering mineral processing and refining impacts, tailings management, and the complex reality of building out new mineral refining facilities, will be released in a few weeks. Now, here's our deep dive into trade, tariffs, and Canadian minerals. I bring you Lyle Trytten. So out of respect for your time, Lyle, and the patience of anyone who's listening to this podcast, I'm going to try to steer us on to DSM question a bit more specifically. So a lot of what's talked about in critical mineral policy in general now is supply chain security, trying to reshore and onshore supply chains, that even if there are mines happening in or Western countries, the processing is happening elsewhere. We're dependent on China and other places in these supply chains. DSM could come in, and if it's being done by friendly actors, then that gives us an opportunity to kind of get control of these supply chains. So then, the question is, once you bring in the processing and refining part of this, does DSM really solve these problems? How does it help us to onshore supply chains?
Okay, so it's a big and complicated question, and I'll try and simplify it a little bit. As Simon Jowett pointed out in an earlier episode, we're not short of land-based resources, and we're not short of land-based resources in supposedly friendly allied countries. That world order has taken a bit of a beating in the last couple of months, which is interesting to see and disturbing to see. The whole process of ally shoring, friend shoring, reshoring is a process to deal with strategic concerns around the supply chain, because so much of the minerals, metals that we need for the energy transition that we are unmistakably in the process of executing are dominated by Chinese interests, whether it's happening in mainland China or by Chinese-controlled operations overseas. Nickel is an Indonesia story under Chinese control. Cobalt is a Congo DRC story, largely, but not completely, under Chinese control. Cobalt and nickel processing is largely a Chinese story today, as well as graphite and germanium and gallium and rare earths and a whole bunch of other things we need. The supply chains are dominated by Chinese enterprises, which raises some concerns for countries like the US, like Western Europe, like Canada, where we don't have as much mining, processing, and refining as we need in order to fully satisfy our own domestic demand for these metals. Broadly speaking, in the West, we import these things from other countries, and that puts a risk on things, as we saw in the pandemic with medical supplies and other things, as we saw in the inflationary bubble coming out of the pandemic. These long supply chains pose risks. This is not new. And we went through this back in the fiscal crisis of 2008 as well, where the auto industry ran into a lot of trouble around just-in-time management of parts. When that supply chain breaks down, you have problems. So where does DSM fit in? There's no shortage of on-land resources. DSM, the nodules, I won't speak to the black smokers and the other undersea things because I think they are much further away from being, an acceptable source of minerals. Deep sea nodules seem to be, more acceptable. There's a very, very large resource there, but it's like ore in the ground. It's just a resource. The key is, can you get it up economically into a form that can be processed? And where do you then process it? And this is where we still have a large struggle because we do not have the processing capacity in the Western countries in order to be able to manage these nodules. They're unlike any other mineral deposit in the world. They're going to require new processing technologies. It's relatively straightforward. We know how to do it. We're not breaking any paradigms here. It's just, it's different than what we're set up to do today. But where is that likely to happen? And I don't think that we're likely to see those major processing facilities be on land in US, Canada, Western Europe. I think they're going to be in other countries. And that's the challenge. Strategically, we'd like to have them onshore. Economically, the reason we buy so much stuff from China and Malaysia and the Philippines and Indonesia and stuff is it's cheaper to make stuff there. There's a bunch of reasons it's cheaper around labor cost and regulations and a whole bunch of things, but it's cheaper to do stuff there. The market in its generic form wants cheap stuff. So nobody today wants to pay a premium for material that is produced in a more friendly jurisdiction or in a more environmentally responsible way. You'll find some people will buy sustainably produced coffee, but most won't. You'll find some people will buy ethically sourced diamonds from northern Canada inscribed with a little polar bear rather than diamonds that might come from a different provenance system in Africa. This is the way people work. This is the way companies work, is they seek the lowest cost solution. So if you're pulling up nodules from the ocean, building that processing capacity is the key to that, because the nodules by themselves are worth absolutely nothing without processing. Where's that process going to be? Maybe India is an answer.
Okay, so then this is the tariffs question. So the U.S. has put tariffs on a lot of its friends and neighbors. I've got my Team Canada shirt on to represent. You're saying, it's just more economic to do this processing elsewhere. The tariffs are, as far as I understand, supposed to make it more economic to do that processing in the U.S. Why? So will that work? And if not, why not?
Well, certainly at its present level, I don't see it working. The U.S. has some great mining and mineral processing and refining in some areas, right? They've got a reasonable steel and aluminum industry, but it's not nearly sufficient to meet their own needs, and it's not going to grow dramatically quickly. They've got a good copper industry in the Southwest, in Arizona and stuff, but it doesn't meet their needs. They import a lot of the needs to enable their manufacturing, which is globally significant, to build things that they then sell both to their own customers internally and they export. So to the extent that they put tariffs on metals that they're buying for their manufacturers, that's an increased cost that they then have to pass on to the customers, which might be end consumers or might be other industrial operations. So let's say you have a stainless steel facility, you're going to buy steel billets and ferronickel or nickel pig iron or nickel briquettes and ferrochrome and ferromolybdenum and all these other things that mostly come from offshore. Those are all going to cost more to make stainless steel. That's now going to be more expensive. That stainless steel is going to go to somebody who's making pipes or tanks or pots for your kitchen or cutlery or the front of your dishwasher. That now is going to be more expensive for that manufacturer to produce. And then they're going to pass those costs on ultimately to customers. To the extent that they're domestic customers, that those domestic customers have to pay more to buy that thing. To the extent that you're exporting, you've now made your exporters less competitive globally versus others that aren't paying those tariffs. So if you want to sell those dishwashers in Canada that are now going to cost a few percent, 5%, 10% more, well, maybe we're buying them from Turkey instead, which incidentally has a very large appliance manufacturing industry. I don't see it working when it applies to these kinds of raw materials that come in for the manufacturing process. And the reality of setting up these industries is that they are very intensive in their use of specific skills and expertise. It's easy to design a new facility on paper. It's hard to build, commission, startup, operate a facility and make it work. And we're seeing this in, the Tianqi lithium refinery in Australia has struggled. The Mountain Pass rare earths mine in California, the restart of that has struggled.
Can you give details on that Mountain Pass? Because that's the one that I think gets talked about a lot, as currently China owns 98% of rare earth processing. Mountain Pass is coming to the rescue. The US has got tons of reserves and they're starting to process them. So we're good.
Mountain Pass is a mine in the sort of California, Nevada area that has operated it used to operate. It's decades old. And it was one of the world's largest supplier of rare earths in decades past. And it got closed down for economic reasons as China expanded its rare earths production business and effectively put it out of business on a price basis. There's well-known instances of this in other enterprises as well, but they just couldn't compete. As we globalize supply chains to get lower cost materials to make things that we want cheaper than they used to be, that's good for consumers. And Mountain Pass just couldn't compete, shut down 20 some years ago, not quite sure on the date, and has restarted recently by a team that looked at it and said, there's still lots of reserves here. We've got good ore that we can process and make these rare earths internally, and that will help solve the problem. So they've installed a new processing line. You would think that, having had a processing line there before, that they would understand how to build and operate this facility, but it has struggled to reach its design capacity. Will they get there? Yeah, maybe. No guarantees. There's a famous set of papers by a researcher, an old American guy, beautiful, beautiful work by a guy named Terry McNulty, that anybody who's interested in developing new facilities in the metal space should read Terrence McNulty's papers on startup of plants and why they go well and why they don't. But, we have a stunning record of failing to achieve design capacity on facilities that incorporate new processes or weren't sufficiently understood or for a variety of reasons Terry goes through. And a lot of these facilities that are struggling are never going to make it. That's the history of our industry. Where we know a lot about the ore and we adopt proven practices that we know well, we tend to do well, right? And so, froth flotation of sulfide minerals from well-characterized ore bodies has a pretty good track record. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. A brand new process to produce something new, and this would apply to DSM processing. The track record isn't that good. There are reasons. You can say your project is going to be unique and you'll overcome these, but I'd also recommend that people read and consider the work done by Professor Bent Fleeberg out of Oxford on mega projects and the uniqueness bias and all the thought process he's brought into mega projects to understand that we have a very consistent track record of doing big things badly because we're not doing them repetitively. We think we're immune from the biases that tend to creep into our engineering and operational mentalities. We don't learn from our past. And this is an area where some of the Chinese entities have really eaten our lunch in the West, is learn from the past and do it better and incrementalize. And as you do the same thing over and over and over again, you get better and better and better at it. In the US, for example, there is a great shortage of geoscientists and processing engineers and things like this that truly understand processes required to operate these types of facilities. And you don't build those overnight. It takes investment in universities. Colorado School of Mines is great, but they're graduating fewer people than they used to. There aren't as many extractive metallurgy programs as there used to be. We just don't have the body of expertise in the West that we used to have. There's a lot more people that look like me than look like you in this space. And that's good for career potential for the younger generations. But we're going to be relying on some of us old guys for a while to impart some wisdom and help train and mentor a new crop of geoscientists and extractive metallurgists to make these things work. And they're not necessarily going to work well the first time, and it's not a short process. If you think starting from ground zero, if they wanted to build, say, a new nickel refinery in the US today, there is, in my view, effectively zero chance that they would be running at design rate 5 years from now. The engineering design process, the approval process, the construction process, the startup process, the debugging of that once they've built it and started it up, it's going to take a decade. So this is not a short period.
We hear a lot about the regulatory hurdles. I think the narrative that I kind of hear is like China is so much faster because they can just push things through regulatory wise. But the idea that even once we get past that, we can't just make a facility run at capacity, even if we put the resources into it. I think that was news to me. And I think that, getting your kind of take on why that is and how hard that is, and that the details really matter, I think hopefully will be useful.
Yeah. So if you were building a new copper refinery, copper oxide, heap leach, acid leach, electrowinning of copper cathode in the southwestern US, I think you'd have a great degree of success today once you were permitted, right? We understand the process really well. It's been used for 40 or 50 years. Lots of people have worked on it. You've got a good body of engineers in the US who have done projects like this in the US and overseas, in Chile and other places. You've got the body of knowledge there. That's going to be probably pretty successful. Not 100% guaranteed, but odds are good that that will work. When you venture into processes that you're not familiar with, ore bodies that are unique, where you try to step out in technology because it looks on paper to be more economic or less impactful, these all add risk of underperformance. And that's the kind of thing that Terry and Ben Fluberg have called out in their work, which is really important for those of us in the industry to understand.
So you're persuading me that the U.S. tariffs aren't going to push them to develop a domestic minerals industry, despite that I've heard from a number of sources that the U.S. is actually really well endowed with minerals. It's one of the few kind of global jurisdictions that could survive deglobalization. Although I think that often when people do that analysis, they kind of include Canada and Mexico in that picture. And I know that you've done a little bit of research recently on how dependent the U.S. is on Canada for certain minerals. So I wonder if you've got those numbers.
Yeah, so I did a quick analysis. For anybody who's interested in this area, the United States Geological Service, provided it continues to exist, who knows, publishes a lot of good work every year on a whole wide range of metals and minerals. Copper, nickel, cobalt, platinum, rare earth elements, all sorts of things that are important to the U.S. economy are covered by the USGS in terms of domestic production, domestic consumption, imports, exports, raw materials, finished goods, global reserves, global production. They cover all of that for all these different minerals. So I took a quick look through some of the more recent information on nickel, copper, cobalt, and platinum group elements. These are things of concern and interest to me, but you could also lump into there some interesting things like uranium and fertilizers and other things. Copper, the U.S. is okay. They make, in the range of half of their own copper needs. And that includes, you have to think of it in our business about primary and secondary. Secondary is recycling. So when you melt down copper scrap to make new copper products out of it, that's an internal process. But you always need fresh copper. So they make about half of their own fresh copper. They import the rest. About 70% of that comes from Chile. And they haven't picked a fight with Chile yet. So, maybe that's a secure source. A bunch of it comes from Canada and Europe as well, where we have big copper refineries. But, maybe that's at risk. When you look at nickel, cobalt, and platinum group elements, the U.S. is dependent on other countries for the vast majority of its supply. Right? The U.S. has effectively zero domestic primary nickel and cobalt today. Right? There's a little operation outside in Missouri that's trying to produce some nickel and cobalt from old tailings facilities. There's a nickel mine in Michigan that ships concentrate up to Canada to get refined. A PGM complex in Montana that ships some nickel and copper northward to be refined, and the PGEs, I think, go offshore for refining. Maybe they get done in the U.S. I'm not quite sure. But in all of these, the U.S. is heavily dependent on imports from Canada, Mexico, Europe, South Africa as a big source for nickel, cobalt, PGEs, all of whom they've picked fights with in the last couple of months. So, ultimately, I think this is all going to come out in the wash. And in 5 years' time, tariffs will be done and we'll be back to more of a globalization. But right now, there's a lot of people that are very angry with the U.S. are maybe not looking to relocate there and help the US develop its own capacity. And the US is short on a lot of minerals. So, some work I did for Natural Resources Canada, Canada happens to be blessed with a lot of nickel, cobalt, and copper. We export a lot of that. We don't use very much internally. A lot of it goes to the US, goes to other countries as well. The US is short nickel and cobalt. It's maybe okay on copper in the long run. If you develop all the reasonably economic known nickel resources in the US, you would still not supply their domestic needs. It's just not there. So they have a problem, right? They're going to be reliant on imports for a long time. When you look at, say, the fertilizer side, the US has a lot of phosphate in Florida. They make a lot of phosphate fertilizers. They make a lot of nitrogen fertilizers from fossil fuels, but they're short potash. Canada is long potash, right? The significant potash producers in the world are Canada and Belarus and I think Kazakhstan. But where are they going to get their potash from if it doesn't come from Saskatchewan? This is a big question. So there are things they're blessed in and things they're not. Uranium, we make a lot of uranium in Canada for a pretty small domestic nuclear industry. We export a lot of it. The US imports a lot of uranium for its nuclear industry. Where's it going to get its fuel from? Australia is a source, but there's a fight going on there too. Kazakhstan, sure, maybe. If you want to cozy up to the Central Asian area, there are resources there. But is that really the world we envision? I'm not sure.
I wonder if you can also just give a bit more detail on the sentiment in Canada for people who don't have relatives in Canada, kind of telling them that they've canceled all of their US-based subscriptions and will never go on a vacation to Hawaii again.
Well, I haven't vacationed in the US for years for a variety of reasons, but there is an astounding amount of anger and bitterness and resentment in Canada right now towards the US. Not the people. We understand that, by and large, people are people, wherever they come from. I've been all over the world. People are people, and there's very nice people in very many places. But the system, the administration, is creating a lot of problems. And this is going to be felt very dramatically in the next year in the real estate markets in Florida and Arizona, where a lot of Canadians like to go down for the winter,
right,
escape the cold. And we call them snowbirds. They go south for 6 months and come back. People are selling their properties, and that's going to lead to a crash in the property value, real estate markets in those areas. People are not going to go there as tourists. So some will still go, of course, but there is an astounding drop in tourism. And the airlines have all now announced that they're canceling flights, changing their flight schedules for the summer months because people are canceling their bookings. And that's changing it's completely restructuring the airline industry. Hotels are not going to do well. Airbnbs are not going to do well. People are pretty upset with Airbnb as an entity, just like they are with Tesla as an entity, because of their work with the administration, doing some, frankly, in my view, pretty stupid things. And so people are venting their anger in the way they know how by boycotting products, boycotting areas. People might feel better about California wine than they do Kentucky bourbon because of the respective voting records of those regions. But, most provinces have pulled American liquor off the shelves. You can't buy Kentucky bourbon in most provinces today. It's gone. It may come back at some point in the future.
It's so interesting how the liquor store becomes the focal point of at least of the news anyway. It's this picture of liquor store shelves being bare where they've actually just pulled.
Well, in most jurisdictions, the liquor stores are government controlled. So the government has a level of authority. And the government of Canada has taken a very surgical approach to identifying products for retaliatory tariffs that are impacting mostly Republican states, right? Because they want to change the approach of the administration. So they're more focused on the states that vote heavily Republican than the states that vote heavily Democrat. They'll get caught in the crossfire too. There's no question. But, it's been a surgical approach as opposed to a blunt, instrument of everything coming from the U.S. is going to get a tariff. No, we've picked certain things. And so the government has been very thoughtful about that. It may change in coming months. This trade war may cool down. It may heat up. But it's a pretty ludicrous thing for two highly allied and highly integrated nations to be pursuing. The amount of integration between our economies in the oil industry, in the metals industry, in the agricultural industry, is pretty astounding. And products go back and forth across the border numerous times as they go through various processing steps. And so if you're introducing tariffs at every stage of that cross-border movement, it's going to get ugly. It's going to get really ugly.
Okay, well, yeah, I'm watching the time and trying to think about how I can segue from this discussion of questionable decisions from the U.S. administration into getting your expertise on decision making in general. This is a question that I'm trying to figure out how to ask all of my guests is, how do we approach decision making in situations of trade-offs across different value categories? I originally kind of focused on deep sea mining because it is often presented as this very quintessential, well, there's going to be unknown harms to ecosystems, but we need these minerals for achieving our energy transition goals, which we can all get behind. So everyone kind of agrees about both of these value categories being important. And then the discussion is kind of like, well, it's a trade-off, and people make those trade-off decisions differently. So given that you've worked in sustainability and various parts of industry, making all sorts of these decisions, I'm very interested to get your take.
Yeah. So, I'm an engineer. I'm conservative by nature because we as engineers, when we build things, if we build them badly, it's bad, right? It's bad for people. It's bad for the environment. If we build a bridge or a shopping mall and it collapses, as has happened, that's a pretty bad outcome. A tailings facility that fails, that's a pretty bad outcome. Toxic gas leak like Bhopal, that's a pretty bad outcome. So engineers are by their nature pretty conservative. We don't subscribe to the Silicon Valley ethos of move fast and break things, because break things is the worst possible outcome in our world. And having run a number of emergency response scenarios to things like toxic gas releases and explosions and things like that, we err on the side of caution. As a conservative person, from a technical standpoint, I think about how do we mitigate the harms and manage them. First, do no harm. Okay, well, that's a good principle, but when we're extracting materials from the natural environment, there's harm. So how do we make those selections? I look at it from the point of view of we need to understand them. You can't understand anything 100. I am not an ecologist. I can't tell you if on land or in sea mining is better or worse. But I think about it from a regulation perspective. There are areas with good regulatory systems and good oversight and control. There are areas with good regulatory systems and terrible oversight and control. So the regulatory system is just a paper thing. And there are areas with terrible regulatory systems. When you think about on-land activities in a jurisdiction like Canada or Norway, we tend to have good regulations and good oversight when the regulator is independent of the industry. So here in Alberta, we have two regulators of environmental impacts. The Alberta Environment, which is a government entity that oversees chemical production plants, for example. And we have the Alberta Energy Regulator, which oversees upstream energy facilities, oil and gas extraction and upgrading and stuff, until the point that it enters as a fossil fuel into the supply chain. Alberta Environment's a great regulator, frankly. I've dealt with them a lot. They've annoyed me a lot. They ask a lot of hard questions, but they make you stick to their rules because they're independent and they take their job very seriously. The Alberta Energy Regulator has come under a lot of pressure because they are considered by many to be a captured regulator. The board is largely comprised of ex-oil executives, appointed because they understand the business. Who better to regulate it than somebody who understands it? But they tend to have a pretty terrible track record about, informing communities, about managing impacts, about ensuring that we have sufficient reclamation of the activities that we've done. That's very different than, say, the mining industry in BC or Ontario, where we have much more stringent regulations on managing impact. When you go to other countries, you see different systems and different levels of enforcement. When you have a remote location, a facility that is on its own on an island in the tropics or in far northern Canada or something, it's very hard for the regulator to just show up and do an independent evaluation. Where you have a society that has an endemic corruption problem, you have to ask the questions of how independent is the oversight provided by the regulator, even in things that they can see, that everybody can see, and in things where it's difficult for them to see. So if the regulator can't get there without company approval, well, then the company knows they're coming. I used to have Alberta environment regulators drop by the refinery site from time to time, just like occupational health and safety regulators would. And that gives them a level of like, they're here, they get access, go and meet them at the gate. That doesn't happen in some jurisdictions. And this is what worries me about the deep sea mining area, is not whether the impacts are better or worse, but they will be opaque. There will be a very significant credibility issue to regulating the activities happening 4 kilometers under the sea, where it's dark and where the regulators can't just show up. Couple that with you have an international seabed authority, international institutions like the UN, like the International Criminal Court, have proven themselves to be pretty toothless in the last decade or two. They talk a lot, they make good policy, but it's hard to force follow through because ultimately countries do what countries want. And I think for the ISA, the US is not a signatory. They're not bound by ISA regulations. They never agreed to it. Just like Antarctica is a hotbed for concern about exploitation, the deep sea is as well, because it's going to be very hard to regulate. It's owned by nobody. It's outside of territorial waters, and there's no ability to have effective regulatory oversight that things are being done properly. So, a given company may go out there and do the right things, and another company or a state entity may go out there and do things completely differently because it's cheaper, easier, faster, whatever. And how are you as a consumer, whether you are an end consumer or a manufacturer that's purchasing, say, nickel for your process, going to know where that came from, what conditions it was done under? We don't have traceability standards yet for that upstream supply chain, and that causes a great deal of concern for people to be able to understand. If I want to buy an electric vehicle or a stainless steel pot, how do I find out where the nickel in that came from? There's no way. Can't do it. Not today. Will we get there? I hope so. I think it's an important step for us as a society, but I'm not hopeful of it happening soon because there's so many potential roadblocks to it by countries simply not agreeing to follow standards.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking about our ability to trust regulators, which from my experience with having these kind of conversations about deep sea mining, trust is definitely, it sometimes seems like people will agree on what we ought to do and then disagree about whether we can trust people to do what we ought to do or what they ought to do. I think it's extremely interesting that you say that the same jurisdiction, so Alberta natural resource extraction, can be either a good or a bad regulator, depending on the specifics of the industry. And like you said, that for some reason, oil executives are coming out of their industry C-suites and then going into regulatory jobs is not happening in mining. Is that just because there isn't that much money in the mining sector? Or maybe you said the chemical sector, but I assumed that was the mining sector. So.
Yeah, so I referred to the chemical sector here, but ultimately the way we're structured, Alberta Environment is a government body. Alberta Energy Regulator is what we call an arm's length body that has an independent board that oversees its activities. And that board is appointed by the government and typically is composed of industry professionals that understand the business. It's not in itself bad, whereas Alberta Environment is run by a minister directly with government officials, paid government officials, the bureaucracy overseeing the entirety of the organization. And so they take a different view to things. That tends to be the case in most environmental regulatory agencies across the Western world, that they're run by government. Alberta Energy Regulator, I pulled it as an example of how things can go badly when you don't have strict government oversight. And so what's going to be the case with the ISA? How is the regulator going to function? And to be clear, I'm not actually talking about trust in the regulator. I'm talking about trust in the producers, where if you don't have regulatory oversight, there's a tendency to work towards the lowest common denominator, right?
Right.
You see this in occupational health and safety all the time, right? We have incidents on sites, people die or get maimed, and the regulator shows up and it's like, yeah, it didn't follow procedures. Whereas if the regulator is sitting on top of them and making sure that the procedures are followed, these incidents don't tend to happen.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a valuable distinction. I've just noticed the time here, and I've used up my allotment with you today. So I guess I'll just jump to. Let me ask you the last kind of question on the Canada topic, which is as far as a mining regulator goes, is Canada a model that is worth replicating?
Yeah, I think so. And what we're seeing in the industry now is Canada and some other countries have really been leading the way. For us, mining regulation is a province by province issue, just because we are a federation as opposed to a country where it's controlled entirely on a country basis. But we have things like the Mining Association of Canada has put together a set of management system protocols called Towards Sustainable Mining that most mining companies adhere to. It's a world leading set of protocols. We're now working on alignment of protocols between, say, MAC with its TSM and the International Council on Metals and Mining. ICMM has a set of protocols. The nickel and copper industries have built their own set of protocols, but they're all now being aligned, which as a former operator, I'm very pleased about, because the worst thing in the world is having to comply with 6 or 7 different management systems. Having one is ideal, and that's where the sustainability world is going. We've got pretty good oversight with the regulators in Canada. Most of them require upfront bonding for the cost of reclamation. So the project I work for in BC, we would have to put up money upfront, usually in a bond or just straight cash with the government, deposit with the government, so that if we go broke, the money is there to reclaim the site to some standard. Not applied across all industries, but we certainly see that in most of the mining industries in Canada. So it's a good jurisdiction. Absolutely. We've seen that those Towards Sustainable Mining standards developed by MAC have actually been adopted by a significant number of countries worldwide, including some in Northern Europe and some in other jurisdictions, because they're a good set of standards. So why redevelop another one? So those are good. I think it's a great model to follow, where we plan for outcomes ahead of time rather than deal with them after the fact, which is the way it used to be. The mining industry, environmental regulation in North America is 50-ish years old, right? The Alberta environment came into being in the 70s, along with the EPA in the US. Before that, industrial activities were largely unregulated. Companies did what they wanted, that met with what their stakeholders, be they shareholders or communities, let them do. And in the mining industry, a lot of times that was just walk away from something at the end of its life and leave it to rot away. And we're dealing with those today, those legacy sites. There's thousands and thousands of them, mostly small, that are contributing negatively to our environment. But that's not the way we build things today either.
Great. Okay, so then let me ask, where can people follow you, keep up with your work?
Well, I'm easy to find. Search for the Nickel Nerd online. You'll find me. I publish pretty much exclusively on LinkedIn, although if you're interested in my political views, those come out more on Blue Sky. You can find me there as well. Lately, more political on LinkedIn as well, as this whole US-Canada thing is blowing up. Trying to keep my opinions a little tamer, but I have a number of white papers and things like that are accessible via my LinkedIn homepage. So feel free to have a look. They're public.
Yeah, and let me just plug those, because they're full of very. If you thought that this conversation was maybe a bit too details heavy, those white papers are a really good balance of getting an introduction to various aspects of different aspects. It's a lot on nickel, and then you also have some just on sustainability in general, which are incredibly insightful. So there's lots there that people can find on your LinkedIn.
Yeah, and I'm actually rewriting the set of sustainability papers that I did 5 years ago. Now, as I continue to learn, and as our world has changed, and I've learned more, so I'm redrafting those for republication over the coming months. So it was a 9-article set, all pretty short, 500 to 1,000 words. They'll probably be a little longer now as I go more in depth on some topics, but it'll cover the wide spread of sustainability in the resource industries. And I'm always open to questions, right? I'm a pretty open guy. I chose to do what I do, running my own company, because I don't want to work full time. I work part time so that I can do this kind of thing, educational in nature, because I think it's really important that citizens of the world understand how our businesses get done and the impacts of the things we do, which some are necessary, some are less necessary. We're always looking at ways to improve, but resource extractive industries by their nature are slow moving when it comes to change.
Yeah, well, as someone who has taken advantage of your generosity with sharing your insights for years now, I can vouch that that's very helpful. And yeah, thanks again for being here today. Thanks again for all of the times you've answered my calls in the past. Yeah, last question. Where else can you recommend people go, other resources, other organizations to follow?
So, there's a ton of stuff out there today. I'm a big podcast fan. I listen more than I watch. I haven't found a ton of great stuff in the mining world. Maybe there's stuff out there that I'm not seeing. On the Rocks by Emily King is a really good series. I don't listen to every episode, but I find a lot of them really interesting. I did a more in-depth nickel podcast with her a couple of years ago. You can find it in the backlogs. I follow a lot of stuff on the energy transition because that to me is the story of where we're going over the next little while. So there I follow people like Michael Leibrick out of the UK and Michael Bernard out of Vancouver, who are focused on the global energy transition. Locally here, if you're an Alberta fan, there's some good content being produced by people like Ed Whittingham with Energy versus Climate. There's some good sort of more North American-based stuff with people like Jesse Jenkins out of Princeton that are looking at the impact of policy and technology. And this is where I get a lot of my learnings from. Some of it is my own experience. I know a lot about hydrogen and ammonia and energy transition systems that way. I have very strong views on them because I've worked with those chemicals. But there's things, I don't know that much about tidal energy. So I look to others to educate me on these things. When it comes to projects and startups and things like that, as I mentioned, Bent Fleeberg from Oxford has been publishing a lot of stuff on LinkedIn lately, and a lot of it is open access stuff on bias and things. But he's got a book out called How Big Things Get Done. Absolutely recommended reading for anybody interested in big projects. I read it it came out a couple of years ago. And then the work by Terry McNulty, we call them in the industry the McNulty curves. And I actually got to meet him in person at a conference last year. And, I had to go a little bit fanboy as a 59-year-old dude. Because this is one of the seminal voices in our industry about, the actual outcomes of things we do. Lots of people design stuff on paper and think they know everything, but sometimes it just doesn't work that well. And I've had projects go well and projects go badly. I understand what happens when it doesn't work out well. It can be a pretty significant negative outcome.
Okay. I'll try to put links to as many of those as I can find in the show notes. And I just want to thank you again, Lyle, for your time.
Thanks very much, Eric. It's been a pleasure here. I'm always, happy to talk to people about our industry and make sure that, this is why I started government relations, is I want people to understand so that they make good decisions, whether it's in what they buy or what policies they write or how they enter the industry. That's why I talk to students as well, is just that educational piece.
Okay. Lyle Trytten, thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much, Eric.
Thanks for listening to part 2 of my conversation with Lyle Trytten. As I mentioned, we're releasing this podcast out of order because of its timeliness. Part 1, where we dive into the environmental impacts and processing complexity, will follow in a few weeks. If you find these conversations valuable, please rate, review, and share the elements of deep sea mining. It really helps others find this podcast.
I throw my arms up